I signed the confession not because I was guilty, but because I was tired. Tired of proving I wasn't lying. Tired of watching his smiling face appear on screens while my name became a synonym for disgrace. He said he'd take care of everything, and he did, just not for me. I thought prison was the end, but it turned out the real sentence was living afterward, knowing that my freedom was worth less than his reputation. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Sarah Miller. I was 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I had been a professional in the world of corporate communications. My official title was Director of Public Relations at Halberton Therapeutics, a mid-size pharmaceutical firm based in Austin, Texas. It wasn't the kind of job that made headlines, but I was good at it. Too good, perhaps. I knew how to handle a scandal before it started, how to write an apology without admitting fault, how to spin doubt into confidence. My job was to make powerful people look clean, even when they weren't. I lived in a modest two-bedroom house on a quiet cul-de-sac, lined with willow trees that leaned a little too far into the street. My daughter Emily, 14, lived with me full-time. Her father had left when she was 6, and while he sent cards on birthdays and checks when it suited him, his presence in our lives was a distant echo. We were just the two of us, and we had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Mornings were for hurried cereal and school runs. Evenings were for leftovers and homework and the background hum of cable news that neither of us really listened to. My life was built on structure. I woke at 6, ran 3 miles before dawn, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and checked my inbox before the city had fully stirred. I wore pencil skirts and button-down shirts in neutral tones. I was precise, dependable, professional. I knew how to read a room. I knew how to navigate silence. My colleagues trusted me. My superiors relied on me. My job wasn't to make decisions, it was to make consequences disappear. Halberton wasn't a giant in the pharmaceutical industry, but it wasn't small either. We specialized in second-generation drugs, reformulations, delivery improvements, the kind of products that didn't cure diseases but made living with them slightly more tolerable. Our flagship drug, Remurex, was designed for chronic pain management. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was profitable, and in our world, that was more important. I had been with the company for nearly 8 years. I had watched CEOs come and go, but I remained steady and invisible, like the steel frame behind a glossy facade. Outside of work, my world was quiet. I didn't host dinner parties or attend galas. I wasn't in book clubs or yoga classes. My time belonged to my daughter and my job, and that narrow orbit suited me. I had friends, but none I would call in the middle of the night. I had family, but they lived 3 states away, and we spoke mostly on holidays. I told myself I preferred it that way. I told myself I was free. On weekends, Emily and I would visit the library downtown, where she would spend hours buried in science fiction, and I would leaf through memoirs, always drawn to the pages where things began to fall apart. I never asked myself why. Maybe I was looking for a warning. Maybe I was just fascinated by the quiet moments before the storm. We had rituals: Sunday pancakes, Tuesday laundry nights, Friday takeout from the Thai place that knew our order by heart. Emily was growing into her own person, sharp, curious, quietly rebellious in the way girls her age often were. I tried not to cling to her too tightly, though I felt the years slipping through my hands like water. I saw the woman she was becoming, and I was proud and afraid, because I knew the world she would enter. I had spent years covering its sins with polished language and staged sincerity. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself that what I did at work stayed at work, that my silence wasn't complicity, it was survival. Sometimes I wondered what people saw when they looked at me: a mother, a professional, a woman with a sensible haircut and a tidy home. I never asked if they saw a person who had begun to vanish beneath her own caution. I didn't ask myself either. There were signs, of course, moments I brushed aside. An offhand comment from a senior executive about burying a report, a memo that disappeared, a data chart that changed subtly between drafts. But it was easy to ignore those things when your job was to keep the waters calm. Easy to forget that calm water can be deep enough to drown in. I wasn't naive. I just didn't want to know what I already suspected: that behind every clean headline was a story someone had paid to disappear. That reputation was currency, and truth was a liability. And then there was Thomas Caldwell. He was the executive vice president of corporate strategy, though he carried himself more like a king than a strategist. He had the kind of presence that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. He was 10 years older than me, impeccably dressed, with a smile that knew exactly how far it could go before becoming dangerous. He wasn't my boss, not directly, but he had power, and in companies like ours, power didn't need a direct line of command. We weren't close, not exactly, but he knew my name. He asked about Emily sometimes. He complimented my work in front of others. He made me feel visible in a place where I had worked hard to become invisible. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just courtesy, just professionalism. But when he asked me to review certain internal documents, just a glance, just a note, just a signature, I didn't say no, because people like me didn't say no to people like him. We edited, we adjusted, we accommodated, and we told ourselves it was nothing, just another task, just another day at work. If I had stopped then, if I had questioned more, resisted even slightly, maybe everything would have turned out differently. But I didn't. I kept walking, one step at a time, into a fire I pretended not to see. At night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sometimes sat on the porch with a glass of wine and stared at the stars, feeling like an imposter in my own life. I had done everything right. I had followed every rule. I had built a life that looked stable from the outside, but I knew how fragile it really was. I knew that all it took was one lie, one decision, one wrong name on one line. I just didn't know that name would be mine. It started with a signature, just one, a black pen in my hand, a page on the conference table, and the weight of an unspoken expectation hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. The document was thin, only 3 pages, internal, confidential. Preliminary compliance summary was printed at the top in small, neat letters. It looked harmless. Most lies do. The request came from above, not directly, never directly, but filtered through layers of implication and practiced vagueness. I had been handed the folder by a legal liaison I barely knew, told it was standard, that they just needed my sign-off to move things forward. No pressure, just process, routine. But it wasn't routine. I knew that the moment my eyes fell on the data table on page 2. The numbers didn't match the ones I'd seen the week before. The success rates were higher, too high, unnaturally consistent, and the footnotes that once flagged variables and patient anomalies were gone, erased like pencil marks under a heavy hand. I remember hesitating, that tiny pause in my breath, that flicker of doubt. It could have been enough. It should have been. But then I remembered the email from Thomas Caldwell earlier that morning, a quick line thanking me for my continued discretion and professionalism. It wasn't a threat, but it was a reminder, I was seen, trusted, valued, for now. So I signed. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the numbers, that compliance and data verification weren't under my purview. I was public relations. My role was message, not method. The document would pass through 6 more hands before reaching regulatory eyes. I was just a checkpoint, a formality, an inch in a mile. But I knew better. I had always known better. The first lie is the hardest. The second feels like routine. By the fifth, it becomes muscle memory. Over the following weeks, more documents came. Some from legal, some from regulatory, some with no cover letter at all. Just my name on a yellow sticky note, an initial in the corner. Each one asked for my signature, and each time I paused a little less. The edges of my doubt softened by routine, worn smooth by repetition. I became a cog in a machine I didn't build, but helped maintain. One silent signature at a time. It didn't feel criminal. It felt like survival. In meetings, I repeated phrases like investor confidence and clinical transparency, my voice steady, my hands still. I helped draft press releases that spoke of progress and patient outcomes, while the data behind those claims sat like a phantom in the corner of every room. The language we used was soft, malleable, unanchored by specifics. Initial results suggest, preliminary analysis indicates, pending regulatory confirmation. Words that floated, carefully avoiding the gravity of truth. Outside the office, I still lived my life. I still made Emily breakfast. I still washed dishes after dinner, still folded laundry on Sundays, while crime shows played quietly in the background. But there was a new tension beneath everything, a hum in the walls of my mind, like electricity building toward a short circuit. I began sleeping less. Dreams were cluttered with numbers and emails and closed doors. I kept my phone charged at all times, my work laptop always open, always near. I jumped at calendar alerts, half expecting subpoenas. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when. Then, on a pale blue Tuesday morning, it arrived. I was in my office preparing slides for an upcoming investor call when the knock came. Firm, official. I turned to see 2 men in dark suits standing just inside the threshold, badges out, expressions carved from marble. Behind them, my assistant's face was pale, her lips parted around a silent apology. They asked me to come with them. No handcuffs. Not yet. Just a quiet urgency, as though the walls had begun to shift around me and I hadn't noticed. We walked through the building like ghosts. I could feel the stairs, the silence rippling behind us like a wake. In the elevator, one of the men said my name softly, as if testing it. Sarah Miller. I didn't respond. I was afraid of how my voice might break. In the federal office, they laid out everything. Printed emails, audit trails, copies of the documents I'd signed, annotated and highlighted, each one a paper cut across my name. They didn't accuse, not at first. They asked questions, calm, clinical. Were you aware? Did you review? Did anyone instruct you? I told them I wasn't sure. I told them I was following protocol. I told them I trusted the people above me. But the words rang hollow, even to my own ears. I wasn't let out in cuffs. That would come later. Back at home, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall for hours. Emily was at school. I didn't know what I would say to her. I didn't know what I could say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. The next day, the company released a statement acknowledging irregularities in compliance documentation, assuring cooperation with federal authorities. My name wasn't mentioned, but I could hear the silence where it belonged. Whispers spread quickly. Coworkers stopped replying. My phone stopped ringing. The office badge stopped working. Thomas didn't call. He didn't need to. His name wasn't on any of the documents. His emails were clean, his hands polished. When the official charges came, they were thick with legal language and cold precision: falsification of regulatory records, conspiracy to defraud, obstruction. My lawyer, a tired man with a briefcase that smelled like dust, told me the plea would be better, that trials were expensive, that juries didn't like complicated cases. He told me I had a choice. I could fight and risk everything, or I could sign again and walk away with less time, less noise, less hope. So I signed again. This time it was my own name I handed over, my own freedom I bartered, my own voice I dimmed in exchange for silence. The line I crossed wasn't a single step. It was a slow drift, like being pulled out to sea 1 inch at a time. And by the time I looked back, the shore was gone. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't something you could easily describe, not exactly. It wasn't just bleach or sweat or damp fabric or metal. It was all of those things woven into something heavier, a scent that settled on your skin and didn't wash off, that followed you into sleep. The scent of somewhere people were not meant to live, but were kept anyway. The scent of captivity. Processing felt like being dismantled piece by piece. My clothes were taken, my name replaced with a number, my belongings shoved into a box I wasn't sure I would ever see again. They cut off the tags from my bra. They searched inside my mouth, under my feet. I was told to squat and cough, told to hold still for the camera, told to answer questions that left no room for hesitation. I was a file to be filled, a shape to be cataloged, and I complied, not because I agreed, but because that's what you do when the ground is no longer yours to stand on. They gave me a uniform. It didn't fit. None of them did. The pants sagged. The shirt choked at the neck. The fabric was stiff, made to last, never made to comfort. I was handed a thin mattress, rolled tight like a tongue that refused to speak, and a pair of shoes with no laces. Laces, apparently, could be dangerous here. The woman who led me to my unit didn't speak much. She walked quickly, her keys clinking like wind chimes without a breeze. The hallways were long and echoing, the walls pale green like sickness, and every door slammed harder than necessary, as if to remind us of where we were. The fluorescent lights hummed above us like a chorus of insects. My first night was in a cell that smelled of old soap and burned plastic. My cellmate didn't lift her eyes. She sat on the top bunk, motionless, her back to the wall. I took the bottom without asking. My mattress thudded onto the metal frame like a body dropping from a height. There was no pillow, just a rolled-up towel. I laid on my side, knees drawn to chest, and stared at the wall where someone had scratched 3 letters over and over until the paint chipped. B-A-D, B-A-D, B-A-D. I didn't sleep that night. I listened to the sounds instead. Footsteps, crying, coughing, shouting from a distant tier. Someone pounded on metal for 20 straight minutes. Somewhere else, someone laughed. A kind of laughter that didn't rise from joy, but fell from madness. And underneath it all, a silence so wide it made you feel like you might fall in if you closed your eyes. Morning came not with sunlight, but with noise. Steel doors opening in unison, guards barking roll call, trays clanging against walls. I stood when they told me. I nodded when I was expected to. I kept my head down. I learned quickly. There were no clocks. Time moved differently here, measured not in minutes or hours, but in counts, in lineups, in meals served on beige trays and eaten in 5-minute intervals. We were cattle in a system built not to punish, but to forget. The days bled into each other like bruises blooming beneath the skin. I watched how others moved, how they spoke. I learned the rules they didn't print in the inmate handbook. Don't ask questions unless you know the answer. Don't stare. Don't touch anyone. Don't expect kindness. Respect is currency, and eye contact is a transaction. There were women here who had killed, women who had watched others die, women who had survived things I couldn't begin to imagine and carried their pain like armor. I was soft among them, too clean, too quiet. They could smell that on you. I kept my back to the wall in the day room. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I didn't sit where I wasn't welcome. My name, Sarah, was shortened to Miller, then often ignored altogether. Sometimes I was new girl, sometimes just a shoulder passed in the hallway. The invisibility was better than the alternative. I missed my daughter like a phantom limb. Her face flickered behind my eyelids when I blinked too long. I imagined her at the kitchen table, her cereal getting soggy as she stared at the empty chair across from her. I wrote her letters, folded with aching care, but didn't always send them. Some felt too raw to release into the world. Others were returned unopened. I kept them under my mattress, lined up like tiny paper graves. Meals were served at tables bolted to the floor. I ate fast, barely tasting anything, always watching the room. Fights broke out without warning, sometimes a word, sometimes nothing at all. Guards stormed in, hands on tasers, shouting numbers and orders. I flinched even when it wasn't near me. I learned to keep my mouth closed and my shoulders square. In the mornings, I volunteered for cleaning duty. Mopping endless hallways gave me something to do with my hands. It was menial, yes, but rhythmic. In the stillness of early hours, before the chaos fully bloomed, I could pretend I was somewhere else. A school janitor, a hotel maid, someone who still had a last name. Books became my salvation. The library was small, but it was a universe of its own. I read everything I could get my hands on: memoirs, legal manuals, poetry collections with bent covers and margins filled with angry scrawls. I began to write. Nothing formal, just fragments. Phrases scratched onto napkins or envelopes or the backs of order forms. Words that weren't evidence, just proof I was still here. There was a woman named Clarissa who ran the library and had once been a paralegal. She had thick glasses and a way of speaking that made everything sound like a closing argument. She told me to keep writing, that sometimes memory was the only thing the system couldn't confiscate. I tried to pray, but the words felt foreign. I whispered them sometimes, half to God, half to myself. I didn't ask for freedom. I didn't feel worthy of it. I asked for silence, for stillness, for something inside me to hold. Every day I woke up to a world that erased softness. You couldn't be delicate here. You couldn't cry too loudly or too often. Grief was a private ritual, performed in darkness under scratchy sheets. I learned to cry without sound, to breathe without hope. The universe I had come from, cubicles, coffee, clipped emails, and after-school math homework, felt like another lifetime, like a dream someone else had lived. I could still remember the feeling of my heels on office tiles, the smell of printer ink, the rustle of silk blouses in the back seat of my car. But it felt fictional now, a TV show I had once loved and forgotten. This place was real, and in this place, I was not a mother, not a professional, not a woman with a voice. I was an inmate, a number on a file, a body behind a door. Time in prison didn't move forward, it folded in on itself. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, a film looped so many times that the colors had begun to fade. I had stopped marking days on the wall. There was no point. The calendar was not a measure of freedom here. It was a reminder of distance. Distance from the person I used to be. distance from the world that had already moved on without me. By the second year, I no longer looked for patterns in the routine. The wake-up bell, the head count, the meals, the work assignments, all of it had blended into one continuous colorless rhythm. My cell was my world, my job a kind of penance. I worked in the laundry unit, sorting and folding uniforms until my hands cracked from detergent and hot water. The air was always thick with steam, and sometimes I pretended it was fog. Fog meant weather. Weather meant a world outside these walls still existed. It was there, in that humid room full of spinning machines, that I first learned how betrayal could smell. There was a girl, though none of us were girls anymore, not really, named Denise. She was sharp, wiry, with eyes that looked older than her face. She had been friendly to me when others weren't. She shared stories about her sons, the smell of rain on the yard, the recipes she would cook when she got out. I listened. I let her in. I should have known better. One morning, a guard found contraband stashed in the laundry bin, painkillers hidden inside a folded sheet. Denise wasn't there that shift. I was. The discovery led to a search, then a report, then a hearing. It didn't matter that I had nothing to do with it. It didn't matter that everyone knew contraband didn't just appear. It moved carefully, with help from both sides of the bars. They wanted someone to blame, and I was convenient. I had kept my head down too long, stayed quiet too often. Quiet made you invisible, but it also made you an easy target. They stripped me of privileges. No library, no phone calls, no visits for 3 months. My protests only deepened their satisfaction. I felt something crack inside me, something that had been straining since the day I arrived. That fracture became a space where rage began to grow. Denise avoided my eyes after that. I saw her once in the chow line, her hands trembling as she gripped her tray. I could have said something, but I didn't. Words were useless currency here. The betrayal didn't surprise me. It confirmed what I was starting to understand. In a place built to erase you, trust was just another form of self-harm. It was around that time I stopped being afraid of the guards. Not because they weren't dangerous, they were, but because fear had burned itself out. You can't keep flinching forever. There's a moment when exhaustion takes the place of terror, when compliance becomes hollow, when the threat of punishment loses its power because you have nothing left they can take. That was my point of no return. The moment when I stopped trying to be who I was before. I let go of the idea that I could preserve something pure inside me. Purity had no function here. Survival did. The fights came more often that winter. The air in the dorm was electric with hunger and anger and boredom. Sometimes they broke out over food, sometimes over words, sometimes over nothing at all. It was like the building itself was infected, the walls sweating violence. I learned how to stay still when chaos erupted, how to fold myself into the corner of the room and watch without breathing. But one day, I didn't move fast enough. It started with an argument between two women over a stolen commissary card. It ended with blood on the floor. When the guards rushed in, swinging batons and barking orders, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the women fell against me. Her blood splattered across my shirt, and suddenly I was part of it. The guards saw 3 bodies in a struggle and didn't bother to separate who was fighting from who was caught in between. The pain in my ribs came fast, white hot, sharp as light. I remember curling in on myself, the sound of boots and shouting and someone screaming my name, though no one here really knew it. Later, in medical, I stared at the bruises spreading across my body like ink in water. The nurse didn't speak. She cleaned the cuts, wrapped the ribs, wrote something in her log. I wanted to ask why she didn't look at me, Why no one ever looked at anyone here? But the words didn't leave my mouth. I realized I had started to fear silence less than sound. After that day, something changed in how I carried myself. I walked slower, heavier, as if each step pressed me further into the ground. I didn't write letters anymore. I didn't dream. I worked, ate, slept. The rhythms of the place had colonized me completely. I no longer thought about the end of my sentence. I thought about getting through the next hour. But then, one afternoon, during a shift in the laundry, I heard my name echo through the intercom. Not the number, the name. It startled me so much I dropped the bundle in my hands. The guard told me I had a visitor. It had been months since anyone had come. For a brief moment, something fluttered in me. Hope, or its ghost. I almost didn't recognize the feeling. In the visitation room, everything was glass and light. The air conditioning hummed too cold. Across the thick pane sat my daughter, Emily. She had grown. Her face was sharper, her shoulders squared. I pressed my hand to the glass. She didn't. Her eyes were steady but distant, like she was looking at a photograph, not a person. I tried to find words to explain, to tell her it wasn't what she thought, that I hadn't meant for any of this. But words here didn't reach across glass. They fell flat against it and slid down like condensation. She left before the timer buzzed. I watched her walk away, her reflection vanishing as she turned the corner. I wanted to run after her, to shout, to pound on the barrier. But I stayed still. I realized then that my punishment wasn't confinement. It was distance from her, from who I used to be, from every version of myself that had ever believed in fairness. That night, back in my cell, I stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks. There were 5, the same number of years left on my sentence. I traced them with my eyes until they blurred. The cell was small, but inside it, my past still echoed. My office, my home, my child. All of it existed somewhere beyond reach. I could no longer tell if I wanted to go back or stay erased. A few weeks later, a guard found one of my old notebooks. I had written in it at night, bits of thoughts, fragments of memory, pieces of who I had been. They confiscated it as contraband. Unauthorized materials, they said. That phrase stayed in my head. Unauthorized. As if my own words no longer belonged to me. It was then that I stopped writing. The silence I had once feared became my only companion. It filled me, wrapped around me like a second skin. I realized that I was becoming the kind of person who could disappear without being missed. The point of no return wasn't a single event. It wasn't the arrest or the conviction or even the day I entered prison. It was this slow erasure, this surrender of self, so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. One morning, I looked at my reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink, and for a moment, I couldn't remember my own face. The features were familiar but hollowed, stripped of expression. I touched my cheek as if to confirm I was still there. Outside the window, a storm rolled in, distant thunder muffled by thick concrete walls. I thought of rain, the smell of it, the way it darkened sidewalks, the sound it made against the windows of my old house. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had stood in the rain. I had crossed so many lines to end up here, and this forgetting, was the one I could never uncross. There was no singular moment when the darkness lifted, no switch flipped, no hand reached through the bars to pull me into daylight. It was more like a softening, a slow thawing after a long, cruel winter. I didn't even notice it at first. The silence I had worn like armor began to crack, not with sound, but with presence, with small, unexpected moments that reminded me I was still alive. It began with a book, I found it lying forgotten on the table in the day room, cover bent, spine broken, pages stained and underlined by hands before mine. It wasn't the title that drew me in. It was the weight of it, real, solid. The kind of book that had passed through a dozen lives and somehow survived. I held it like something sacred, a thread to somewhere else. I took it back to my bunk and read it in 2 days, devouring the words like food. After that, I returned to the library more often, not just to read, but to breathe. The air in that small room felt different, quieter, kinder. Clarissa, the woman who ran it, noticed. She said nothing, but her eyes softened when she passed me new books. Poetry, essays, stories written by people who had also been forgotten. I clung to their words like rope in a deep well. One afternoon, while shelving a returned stack, I came across a program flyer folded between the pages of a magazine. It was for a writing workshop, 6 weeks, led by an outside volunteer, focused on self-expression and rehabilitation through storytelling. My first instinct was to dismiss it. I had given up writing. My words had been taken, marked as contraband. But something in me, something stubborn and flickering, decided not to throw the paper away. I signed up. The workshop was held in a dusty classroom at the edge of the facility, a place where the ceiling tiles sagged and the heat barely worked. There were 8 of us, all women, all at different stages of our sentences and survival. The instructor was a woman named Maggie, older, silver hair pulled into a knot, eyes that didn't flinch. She didn't ask for our crimes. She asked us to bring a memory. The first assignment was to write about a place we used to love. I sat with the blank page for 10 minutes, pen hovering, heart clenched. Then I began to write, not about my house or my office or even my daughter's laughter, though all of it lived inside me, but about a parking lot, a stupid, cracked, sun-baked parking lot where Emily and I used to eat drive-through ice cream in the summer with the windows down. We'd sit in silence, legs sticking to the seats, music low, sharing spoonfuls between sighs. By the time I finished, I was crying, quietly, so no one could see. The tears weren't for the memory, but for the fact that I had forgotten it until I was forced to remember. My life hadn't only been mistakes. There had been sweetness, too. Small, messy, perfect moments that I had buried beneath guilt and grief. We read our pieces aloud. At first, the room was stiff, everyone defensive. But week by week, the stories came. One woman wrote about her grandmother's garden, another about the first time she held her son. Each story was a seed, planted in soil we'd thought long dead. I began to speak more, to listen more, to laugh sometimes. Softly at first, then with air in my lungs again. Outside the classroom, nothing had changed. The guards were still cruel. The days were still gray. But I changed. Writing gave me a rhythm of my own. I began waking with purpose again, not dread. I found myself looking forward to the page, to what I might uncover next. The words became a place to go, a shelter, a mirror. Maggie brought in a guest one week, a woman who had served time and published a book of essays about her experience. She stood in front of us with the kind of presence that made you straighten your spine. She spoke about shame, about truth, about what it meant to reclaim your own narrative. Her voice trembled when she talked about being reunited with her daughter. I didn't blink. I couldn't. After the session, I stayed behind and asked Maggie if I could write to her. Not the guest speaker, my daughter. I hadn't tried in over a year. The last time I wrote, the letter had been returned unopened. A silent rejection that stung worse than words. But something had shifted. I didn't expect forgiveness. I just needed her to know I was still here. I drafted the letter for days, rewrote it 6 times. In the end, I didn't talk about prison. I talked about books, about the parking lot, about how I missed the sound of her chewing when she was thinking. I didn't ask her to write back. I told her I understood if she couldn't. I told her I loved her, that I always had. I mailed it without expecting a miracle. 2 weeks later, I received a card. It was short, 6 words. I got your letter, thank you. That was all. But it cracked something open in me, something that had been sealed shut for too long. Hope was not a flood, it was a trickle. But even a trickle could carve through stone with enough time. I continued the writing program until it ended. Then Maggie found a way to let me keep submitting pieces to an online publication that featured work by incarcerated women. They printed my first essay under a pseudonym, but I knew it was mine. That was enough. Seeing my words out in the world again, honest, flawed, real, felt like a reclamation, not of my old life, but of my voice. Other women in the unit started coming to me for help with their letters, their grievances, their own writing. I became something I hadn't been in a long time, useful, not just to the system, but to the people inside it. That changed the shape of my days. It gave them color. One of the guards, a younger woman who didn't speak much, once handed me a note folded into the spine of a donated book. It said, "Your words made me cry, in a good way." She never mentioned it again, but she started treating me differently after that. A little more patience, a little more space, a little more humanity. Sometimes I still woke in the middle of the night, gasping. Sometimes I still dreamed of the day they came for me, of Emily's face behind the glass, of the sound of my own name being dragged through courtroom air. But those dreams no longer swallowed me whole. They passed through me like weather. I had found shelter, and still nothing was promised. My sentence remained. The world outside hadn't shifted to make room for me, but I was no longer waiting for rescue. I was writing my own map out, line by line. I found myself rereading that first letter I had sent Emily, not to relive the moment, but to remind myself what it meant to risk vulnerability, to tell the truth, not the version I had once spun in conference rooms, but the kind that bleeds when you speak it. That was the real light at the end of the tunnel, not release, not redemption, but the quiet certainty that even in the deepest dark, I still had something no one could take, my voice, my story, and the will to keep telling it. The day I was released, the air felt different, sharper, too loud, too bright. It was as if the world had gone on living without me, evolving into a place I no longer understood. I stepped out of the prison gates with a box in my hands and a plastic bag that held everything I owned. A pair of worn sneakers, a few books, a letter I had read so many times the paper had softened. I had imagined this moment countless times. I thought I would run, breathe, cry, collapse, but instead I just stood there, still, hollow, like I had left a part of myself behind and wasn't sure I wanted it back. The officer who walked me out didn't say goodbye. She closed the gate behind me with a clang that sounded like a final verdict. No one waited for me. No signs, no hugs, no familiar arms. Just the gravel parking lot and the long road that stretched like a question mark into the distance. I started walking. There was a halfway house on the other side of the city. They had approved my stay there for 90 days. A clean bed, group therapy, job readiness programs. That's what they promised. It sounded like a plan. It sounded like progress. But even as I boarded the bus that would take me across town, I felt the weight of something I couldn't name tightening around my chest. I wasn't in prison anymore, but I wasn't free either. The bus windows showed a world I didn't recognize. storefronts I had never seen, billboards in colors too bright, people glued to screens I had never held. The speed of everything frightened me. The city pulsed and shimmered like it had forgotten to slow down while I was away. Everyone moved with purpose. Everyone belonged somewhere. I didn't know where I fit anymore. At the halfway house, they gave me a thin mattress on a metal frame in a room with two other women. One of them snored. The other smoked out the window and never spoke unless she had to. There were rules here, too. Curfews, chores, mandatory meetings, no phones unless supervised, no leaving without permission. It was painted in softer colors, but it was still confinement. I learned how to sleep with my shoes on just in case. Old habits, they didn't vanish. They settled in your bones. I was assigned a case manager named Linda. She was kind in the way people are when they're trained to be. She asked about my goals, my plans, my support system. I answered her with careful phrases. I told her I wanted to work. I told her I wanted to rebuild. I didn't tell her that I woke up each morning unsure of who I was supposed to be, that sometimes I stared at my reflection and saw a stranger mimicking my face. Finding work with a record was harder than I had prepared for. The applications asked the same questions. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? I checked yes, always yes, and always the silence followed. A polite rejection, a job never offered, a door never opened. Eventually, I stopped hoping for callbacks. I started showing up to interviews with a quiet resignation in my voice. I learned to smile without expectation. I landed a part-time job at a diner that didn't ask questions. It paid in cash mostly. I wiped tables and poured coffee for customers who didn't look up. I was grateful for the noise, the routine, the smell of grease and burnt toast. It filled the silence in my head, gave me something to do with my hands. No one there knew my name. Not really, and that felt like safety. I tried to call Emily. I rehearsed the words in my head for days. When I finally dialed her number, my fingers trembled. The phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. I left a message. I told her I was out, that I was working, that I missed her. I didn't say anything about forgiveness. I knew better. That word had become too heavy to carry. She didn't call back. At night, I walked the city streets, not far, just enough to remember the feeling of movement. I watched people through windows, families at dinner, couples laughing over drinks, children running down sidewalks. I tried to imagine myself among them. I couldn't. I felt like a ghost pressed against glass. Freedom, I learned, was not the opposite of prison. It was its echo, a new kind of confinement, one painted in invisibility and silence. Out here, no one watched you. No one ordered you. But no one saw you either. You became a shadow walking beside the world, a presence people stepped around without noticing. The hardest part wasn't starting over. It was knowing you didn't get to. You carried everything with you, the past, the shame, the silence, the way people looked at you when they found out, the way they stopped looking at you altogether. I started writing again, late at night, with a pen I bought from the gas station and a notebook I kept hidden under the mattress. The words came slowly at first. I didn't try to make them beautiful. I just needed them to be honest. I wrote about fear, about hunger, about the smell of bleach and metal. I wrote about a girl eating ice cream in a parking lot, and a woman who forgot how to cry, and a name that had once meant something. One day, I mailed a short essay to the same online journal that had published my work from prison. They accepted it, posted it under the same pseudonym. No one knew it was me, but I knew. That was enough. I kept writing. Each piece felt like a small rebellion, a way to carve space in a world that kept trying to erase me. Some nights, I dreamed of prison, But more often, I dreamed of blank rooms, of endless halls, of searching for something I couldn't name. I would wake with my heart racing, my hands clenched, and then I would breathe, slowly, deeply. I had learned how. After 3 months, the halfway house told me I had to leave. I had saved just enough for a studio apartment in a crumbling building on the edge of the city. The walls were thin, the heat barely worked, but it was mine. I taped pages of my writing to the refrigerator. I bought a secondhand plant from a street vendor. I named it Grace. I didn't find peace, not exactly, but I found rhythm. I woke, I worked, I wrote. I learned how to be alone without being lost. I learned how to sit in silence without disappearing. One morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar, uneven, but certain. It was from Emily. It was short. I read your story. I didn't know everything. I don't know what to say yet. But I wanted you to know I saw it. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. I didn't cry. I breathed. Freedom, I had discovered, was not a gate swinging open. It was not applause or welcome or redemption. It was a long road with no signs, a language I had to relearn, but it was mine to walk, and I was still walking, one step at a time.